So, Donald Trump just called the Prime Minister of Canada governor. Not as a joke, not as a slip. He stood at a press conference, looked into the cameras and said, "We've got the governor of Canada calling us up, wanting to make a deal." Governor, that's what he is. He's a governor. Canada is like a state, a big cold state with not a lot of people. The crowd laughed. Trump repeated it. He liked the sound of it. Governor. And then 6 hours later, Canada announced a comprehensive strategic review of every single energy export agreement with the United States. Here's why that combination should terrify you if you live anywhere in New England. 6 American states, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, depend on Canadian hydropower to keep the lights on. In some of those states, the dependency isn't partial. It's near total. And the man Trump just called governor controls the switch. Warren Buffett, who owns one of the largest energy utilities in America, responded to the announcement with a statement about infrastructure dependency that energy analysts are calling the most alarming assessment of American grid vulnerability ever issued by a private sector figure. When you hear how much power Canada actually sends into New England, what happens to those 6 states if that power gets reduced or renegotiated, what Carney's government is actually planning, and what Buffett said about a president who insults his own energy supplier, you'll understand why 6 American governors just issued an emergency joint statement begging Trump to stop. Hit subscribe because this situation is developing fast and it's going to get worse before it gets better. Let me start with the insult, because understanding what Trump said and why he said it is essential to understanding how dangerous the situation has become. Trump has been escalating his rhetoric about Canada for months. The 51st state comments the annexation talk, referring to the US-Canada border as an internal boundary. It's part of a deliberate strategy to diminish Canadian sovereignty, to make Canada seem smaller, less important, less deserving of respect on the world stage, and calling Mark Carney governor is the sharpest expression of that strategy yet. It's not just disrespectful, it's a linguistic annexation. You don't call a prime minister governor unless you believe or want your audience to believe that his country isn't really a country, that it's a territory, a possession, something that belongs to you and just doesn't know it yet. In Trump's world, this is a power move. You shrink the other person, you reduce their status, you turn a head of state into a regional administrator and a sovereign nation into a province. His base loves it because it feeds the narrative of American dominance. The idea that the United States is so powerful that its closest ally is essentially a tenant, not a neighbor. The rally crowd ate it up. Social media exploded with memes and Governor Carney hashtags. For about 12 hours it looked like another successful Trump dominance play. But here's where the dominance fantasy collides with a reality that no amount of branding or crowd work can change. That Governor Trump was mocking. He controls more electricity flowing into New England than any actual American governor controls in their own state. The state Trump thinks Canada is. It provides the power that keeps actual American states from going dark in January. And the man Trump tried to shrink to a regional subordinate is sitting on top of an energy infrastructure so massive, so critical to American daily life, that insulting him isn't tough, it's suicidal. Let me show you exactly what I mean. Hydro-Québec is one of the largest hydroelectric utilities on the planet. Not in North America, on the planet. It operates 63 generating stations spread across the Canadian province of Quebec, with a total installed capacity of over 37,000 megawatts. To put that in perspective, that's more generating capacity than many entire countries possess. The system is fed by enormous northern reservoirs, some so large they're visible from space, that function as natural batteries, storing energy in the form of water and releasing it on demand. It is by any measure an energy superpower. And for decades, Hydro-Québec has been exporting massive amounts of electricity south across the border into the northeastern United States through a network of high-voltage transmission lines. Those lines cross into Vermont, into Maine, into New York. They feed directly into the New England power grid. And the states on the receiving end of those lines have built their entire energy infrastructure around the assumption that Canadian power will always be there. Let me walk you through it state by state, because the depth of this dependency is staggering. Vermont. This is the most exposed state in the country. Vermont imports virtually all of its electricity from Quebec through long-term purchase agreements. The state closed its only nuclear plant, Vermont Yankee, in 2014. It has limited natural gas infrastructure, limited fossil fuel generation of any kind. What Vermont has is transmission lines running north into Canada, and contracts that bring Canadian hydropower south. Without those contracts, Vermont doesn't have an energy policy. It has an energy crisis. Maine. The New England Clean Energy Connect. The NCC transmission line delivers 1,200 megawatts of Canadian hydropower into the main grid, and from there into the broader New England system. That's enough electricity to power over 1 million homes. Major hospitals in Portland. schools across the state, municipal water systems, emergency services, all connected to a grid that depends on Canadian power flowing through that line. Massachusetts, the state signed a massive long-term deal for Canadian hydropower delivery, specifically to meet his clean energy targets. Boston's grid relies on Canadian imports during peak demand periods, when every office building in the financial district and every home in the suburbs is running air conditioning in summer or heating in winter. The margin between stable grid and blackout gets razor thin. Canadian hydro is what keeps that margin positive. New Hampshire limited domestic generation capacity, aging infrastructure. Canadian power fills the gap that New Hampshire can't fill on its own, especially during winter peaks when demand spikes and domestic supply falls short. The state has been transitioning toward renewable energy, which is admirable, but creates a reliability problem. Wind and solar are intermittent. They produce power when conditions are right, not necessarily when demand is highest. Canadian hydropower provides the reliable baseload that keeps the grid stable when the wind stops blowing and the sun goes down. New York. The downstate grid, the grid that powers New York City, Long Island, and the Hudson Valley, imports significant amounts of Quebec electricity. During peak demand periods, particularly summer heat waves and winter cold snaps, that imported power is the difference between a functioning city and a city in crisis. 20 million people in the New York metropolitan area, and a meaningful portion of their electricity comes from generators sitting in northern Canada, 6 states, over 20 million Americans, their lights, their heat, their hospitals, their schools, their businesses, all dependent to varying and in some cases terrifying degrees on electricity generated in Canada, transmitted across the border through high-voltage lines and delivered by a utility controlled by a government that the President of the United States just publicly degraded. And here's the part that makes the governor insult go from reckless to potentially catastrophic. New England's power grid is uniquely vulnerable in winter. The region has a well-documented problem. When temperatures drop below freezing and stay there, demand for heating skyrockets. Natural gas, which would normally fuel power plants, gets diverted to home heating because the pipeline infrastructure can't deliver enough for both. That creates a gap. Power plants can't get the fuel they need to generate electricity at exactly the moment when electricity demand is highest. Canadian hydropower fills that gap. It's the region's winter insurance policy. It's the backup system that prevents the entire grid from failing during polar vortex events. ISO New England, the independent operator that manages the regional power grid, has publicly warned about winter reliability risks for years. They've said in official reports that the region faces fuel security challenges during extended cold spells. They've modeled scenarios where sustained cold weather combined with supply disruptions could lead to rolling blackouts. And in every one of those models, the variable that prevents catastrophe is imported Canadian hydropower. During a polar vortex, when temperatures drop below zero and every heater in New England is running at maximum, when hospitals are increasing power draw for heating and emergency systems, when elderly residents in rural Vermont are depending on electric heat to survive the night, Canadian hydropower isn't a supplement, it's survival. Without it, the grid doesn't just get strained, it fails. People don't just lose comfort, they lose heat, they lose light. They lose the electricity that runs the medical equipment keeping vulnerable people alive. A nursing home in Burlington, a dialysis center in Portland, a family with a newborn in a house that drops to 40 degrees without power. These aren't hypotheticals. These are the scenarios that ISO New England grid operators model every single year. And in every scenario, the variable that prevents catastrophe is Canadian hydropower. Think about that for a moment. The safety net for 20 million Americans during the most dangerous weather events of the year is electricity generated in another country, a country whose prime minister, the President of the United States, just called governor on national television. And there is no plan B. New England cannot replace Canadian hydropower quickly, and it may not be able to replace it at all. Building new generating capacity takes years. Permitting, environmental review, construction, grid interconnection. You're talking about a decade minimum for anything meaningful. Importing liquefied natural gas through terminals in Boston and elsewhere is an option. But LG is expensive, supply is globally constrained, and the terminals have limited throughput capacity. Renewables are growing, but wind and solar are intermittent and cannot provide the reliable baseload or peak winter power that the grid requires. And nuclear, the one technology that could theoretically replace Canadian hydro's reliability profile, is politically toxic in New England. Most of the region's nuclear plants have already been decommissioned. There is no plan B. The grid was built on the assumption that Canadian power would always be there. Always affordable, always reliable. That assumption just became the most dangerous bet in American energy. And Mark Carney just called the bet. When reporters asked Carney about Trump's governor comment, his response was a masterclass in restraint. He said, "I represent a sovereign nation of 40 million people. Our sovereignty is not a matter of opinion, and it is certainly not affected by nicknames." Then he moved on. He didn't get drawn into a name-calling exchange. He didn't fire back with an insult of his own. He didn't take the bait. He just calmly acknowledged reality. Canada is a sovereign country, and no amount of branding changes that, and pivoted to the announcement that actually matters. Canada, Carney said, would be launching a comprehensive strategic energy review of all energy export agreements with the United States. Every contract, every pricing structure, every long-term commitment, nothing was off the table. The review would assess pricing, specifically whether Canada has been undercharging American utilities for hydropower exports that are becoming increasingly valuable on global markets as the world transitions away from fossil fuels. Clean, reliable, on-demand hydroelectricity is one of the most valuable energy commodities on Earth right now, and Canada has been selling it to New England at rates negotiated decades ago. Those rates, Carney suggested, may no longer reflect the true value of what Canada is providing. The review would also evaluate supply allocation, whether Canadian provinces should receive priority access to domestically generated power before any surplus is exported south. This is significant because several Canadian provinces, particularly Ontario, have their own growing electricity needs. Why should Canadian ratepayers subsidize American consumers? Carney's energy minister asked in a follow-up press conference when Canadian communities could use that power themselves. It would examine contract renewal terms, whether future long-term agreements should include diplomatic relations clauses, effectively tying energy exports to the health of the bilateral relationship, and it would explore diversification, whether Canada should invest in redirecting energy exports to other markets entirely, including potential partnerships with European nations seeking reliable clean energy imports. Carney didn't threaten to cut the power. He did something smarter. He created uncertainty. And in energy markets, uncertainty is almost as destructive as an actual supply disruption, because utilities need to plan. They need to know months and years in advance how much power they'll have access to and at what price. The moment that certainty disappears, everything downstream starts to wobble. Procurement strategies fall apart. Budget projections become unreliable. Winter reliability guarantees become impossible to make. Wholesale electricity futures for the New England region spiked within hours of the announcement. Not because any power had been cut, not because any contract had been canceled, just because the possibility was now on the table. The mere suggestion that Canada might adjust terms sent prices soaring, and then Carney made a second announcement that energy analysts are calling the real strategic bomb. He said Canada would be accelerating investment in east-west transmission infrastructure, new high-capacity lines connecting Quebec's surplus power to Ontario, Manitoba, and the Atlantic provinces. He announced immediate funding for feasibility studies and fast-tracked environmental assessments. In plain language, Canada is building the infrastructure to redirect the electricity that currently flows south into the United States. They're creating domestic alternatives so that if they choose to reduce American exports, they have somewhere else to send the power. Every megawatt that gets redirected east-west within Canada is a megawatt that no longer needs to flow south. He also mentioned almost casually that preliminary discussions were underway with European partners about undersea cable connections for transatlantic power export. That's a long-term project years away from reality. But the signal matters more than the timeline. Canada is telling the world we have options. We don't need the American market. We can sell this power to our own provinces, to Europe, to anyone who treats us like a sovereign nation rather than a subordinate. Carney isn't threatening. He's building options. And a country with options is a country you can't bully. A country with options doesn't need to cut your power to hurt you. It just needs to make you wonder whether it might. The governor who controls your electricity doesn't need to trade nicknames with the president. He just needs to review the contract. And then Warren Buffett weighed in, and what he said stripped away every layer of politics and posturing and reduced this crisis to its engineering reality. Buffett was asked about the Canada energy situation at a Berkshire Hathaway shareholders event in Omaha. He paused for a long time before answering, longer than aides said they'd seen him pause in years. The room went quiet. When he spoke, the frustration in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't the measured, folksy Buffett the public is used to seeing. This was a man who runs energy infrastructure for a living, watching someone set fire to a critical relationship out of ego. In 60 years of running businesses, Buffett said, "I've learned one rule that never changes. You do not antagonize your critical suppliers. You don't insult them. You don't belittle them. You don't call them names on television, because the day you need them, and you will need them, the relationship you destroyed is the relationship that could have saved you." He said New England's electricity grid is dependent on Canadian hydropower, and that this isn't a political opinion or a policy preference or a talking point. That's engineering, he said. That's physics. The electrons don't care who the president is or what he calls anybody. The grid either has enough power or it doesn't. You can't tweet your way out of physics. You can't brand your way out of a grid that doesn't have enough domestic generation to keep the lights on. Then he delivered the line that's been replaying on every news network since and is already being printed on protest signs outside the White House. Calling the Prime Minister of Canada governor when his country controls the electricity for 6 American states isn't tough. It's the strategic equivalent of insulting your surgeon while you're on the operating table. Buffett went further. He revealed that Berkshire Hathaway Energy, one of the largest energy utilities in the United States, serving millions of customers across multiple states, has been conducting internal assessments of cross-peer energy dependency for the past several months, specifically because of the deteriorating U.S.-Canada relationship. What we found is alarming, he said. New England has systematically underinvested in domestic generation capacity for decades. They closed nuclear plants, they restricted natural gas pipeline expansion, they blocked new generating facilities on environmental grounds without building alternatives first, and they relied increasingly dangerously irresponsibly on Canadian imports to fill the gap that their own policy decisions created. That strategy worked as long as the USC relationship was stable and predictable. The relationship is no longer stable, it is no longer predictable, and that changes everything. He called it a 40-year infrastructure failure that is about to collide with a diplomatic crisis created by a single insult, and he warned with visible emotion that the people who will pay the price aren't politicians sitting in heated offices in Washington or pundits talking on cable news from warm studios in New York. They're families in Vermont who need heat in January. They're hospitals in Maine that need reliable power for life support equipment and operating rooms. There are elderly Americans in rural New Hampshire who heat their homes electrically because no gas line reaches their road. They're small businesses that can't survive a 30% increase in their electricity bill. Those are the people who pay when a president decides that getting a laugh at a rally is more important than maintaining the relationship that keeps 20 million Americans warm. When pressed on the potential impact, Buffett was blunt. If Canada renegotiates energy pricing, which they have every sovereign right to do, electricity costs in New England could increase by 30 to 40%. If they redirect supply to domestic priorities, which any rational nation would consider given the current diplomatic environment, parts of New England face rolling blackouts during winter peak demand. He paused again. A country that can't keep its own lights on has no business starting fights with the country that can. The quote that energy analysts are calling the most important, energy dependency is not a talking point, it's a vulnerability, and you don't advertise your vulnerabilities by insulting the people who can exploit them. The fallout since the review announcement has been swift and it's accelerating. 6 New England governors, Republicans and Democrats together, issued an unprecedented joint statement within 24 hours. They did not mention Trump by name, but the message was unmistakable. The statement called for immediate diplomatic de-escalation with Canada and warned that the energy security of 20 million Americans should not be collateral damage in a trade dispute or a war of words. Vermont's governor, a Republican, went further in a separate interview. He said, "Our state depends on Canadian hydropower. That's not politics, that's reality. I can't heat Vermont homes with press conference rhetoric, and I need someone in Washington to start dealing with reality instead of trading insults with the people who keep our lights on." The governor of Maine, also a moderate Republican, said her office had been fielding hundreds of calls from constituents asking whether they should buy generators before winter. People are scared, she said. They're not scared of Canada. They're scared of their own government's inability to maintain a functional relationship with our energy supplier. When Republican governors are publicly begging a Republican president to stop picking fights with the state's energy supplier, when they're openly contradicting the White House's tough talk posture, the situation has moved past politics. This is survival territory. The grid operators moved even faster than the politicians. ISO New England held an emergency briefing for state utility regulators within 36 hours of the review announcement. The briefing was classified as confidential, but sources who attended described the tone as controlled panic. The grid operator walked regulators through winter reliability scenarios under various Canadian supply reduction levels, 10%, 20%, at 30%. The model showed rolling blackouts during sustained cold events. Utility companies across all 6 states activated contingency planning processes that hadn't been triggered since the last major grid emergency. Emergency procurement of liquefied natural gas shipments was initiated, but at spot market prices that are 3 to 4 times higher than contracted Canadian hydropower rates. The math is brutal. Replacing Canadian hydro with emergency LNG doesn't just cost more, it costs catastrophically more. And ultimately, there isn't enough LNG import capacity to fully replace what Canada provides. Anyway, insurance companies that underwrite grid stability in the region began reassessing their New England exposure. One major insurer reportedly placed a hold on all new policies for grid-dependent industrial facilities until the situation clarifies. The price impact hit immediately, and it hit hard. Wholesale electricity prices in the New England market jumped 18% within 48 hours of the review announcement. That's not a gradual adjustment. That's a shock. And that increase flows directly through to consumer bills. Every household, every business, every hospital, every school, every church in the region. A family in Vermont already paying $200 a month for electricity could see bills rise to $260 for a household on a fixed income, and there are hundreds of thousands of them across New England. That's devastating. It's the difference between keeping the thermostat at 65 and dropping it to 55, between eating 3 meals a day and skipping one. For a small restaurant or retail shop already operating on razor-thin margins in a region with some of the highest operating costs in America, that increase is potentially fatal. And remember, this is just from the announcement of a review. No power has been reduced, no contract has been altered, no supply has been cut. The mere possibility, the suggestion, the hint, the whisper that Canada might adjust the terms of its energy exports sent costs soaring across the entire region. Markets are pricing in a risk that didn't exist 6 months ago, because 6 months ago nobody imagined the President of the United States would go out of his way to insult the country that keeps his Northeast states running. Imagine what happens to those prices if Canada actually follows through. Imagine what a 20 or 30% supply reduction does to a market that's already spiking on uncertainty alone. And here's the part that should keep the White House up at night. Trump's strongest supporters in New England, the rural voters in small towns across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, who turned out for him in droves. They heat their homes electrically because natural gas pipelines don't reach their communities. Many are on fixed incomes, retirees, Social Security recipients, veterans on disability. They live on budgets that don't have room for a 30% utility increase. $100 extra a month in electricity costs means choosing between heat and medication, between keeping the lights on and buying groceries. These are Trump's people. They wore the hats, they put up the signs, they cheered when he called Carney governor, and they will be the first to suffer when the consequences of that insult land on their doorstep. The cruel irony of the governor comment is that the voters who cheered the loudest when Trump said it are the ones who will pay the steepest price for what it provoked. The rally crowd in a warm convention center laughed at the joke. The family in a poorly insulated farmhouse in northern Vermont will not be laughing when their January electricity bill arrives. Republican donors across the Northeast are furious. Major fundraisers in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York. People who write the checks that keep Republican campaigns running are watching their energy costs spike and their commercial property values destabilize in a region whose economic vitality depends on reliable, affordable power. Several donors have reportedly called the Republican National Committee to demand that someone in the White House explain how insulting Canada's Prime Minister with a schoolyard nickname serves any strategic purpose whatsoever. None received a satisfactory answer. Democratic governors, meanwhile, are seizing the moment to push for massive domestic energy investment, new generation, new transmission, new storage. But every honest analyst in the room knows that's a decade-long project at minimum. The crisis is hitting now. The bills are going up now. Winter is approaching now. You can't build a power plant in 6 months. You can't lay a transmission line before the first snowfall. The gap between what New England needs and what it can provide for itself is measured in years, and no amount of emergency planning closes it before the cold arrives. And there's a dimension to this that goes beyond politics and economics entirely, a dimension that the Pentagon has been quietly tracking for years and is now openly alarmed about. Military installations across New England Naval Submarine Base, New London and Connecticut, Port South Naval Shipyard in Maine, Hanscom Air Force Base in Massachusetts, the Coast Guard Academy in New London, all operate on the same regional grid that depends on Canadian imports. The Department of Defense has backup generators for critical operations, but those generators run on diesel fuel and are designed for short-term emergencies, not sustained grid instability. A prolonged reduction in Canadian power imports would strain military readiness in ways that defense planners have modeled but hoped they'd never actually face. Defense analysts have been quietly flagging cross-border energy dependency as a national security vulnerability in internal assessments for at least a decade. The concern was always theoretical, a what-if scenario that assumed the US-Canada relationship would remain stable enough to manage. Trump just turned that theoretical concern into an operational reality. He took a vulnerability that defense planners had been carefully monitoring and turned it into an active threat. Not because Canada attacked, not because there was a military confrontation, but because the President of the United States couldn't resist calling another nation's leader a demeaning nickname and dared him to respond. NATO allies are watching this dynamic with deep concern. If Canada, a founding NATO member, one of America's closest military allies, a country that has fought alongside the United States in every major conflict since World War II, can be provoked into using energy infrastructure as a strategic lever. It sets a precedent that reverberates through every alliance relationship on the planet. Energy leverage isn't a Canadian invention. Russia used it against Europe for years, weaponizing natural gas exports to punish countries that defied Moscow. The Middle East used oil as a weapon during the 1973 embargo,
But those were adversaries, opponents, countries with hostile intentions. The idea that an ally, a close trusted NATO treaty ally, might use energy leverage against the United States because the president couldn't stop himself from throwing schoolyard insults, that's unprecedented territory. That's a category of diplomatic failure so basic, so entirely self-inflicted that career State Department officials are reportedly struggling to explain it to their foreign counterparts without embarrassment.
So, here's where we stand. The President of the United States called the Prime Minister of Canada governor, a deliberate demotion designed to diminish Canadian sovereignty and entertain a rally crowd. In response, Canada announced a strategic review of all energy export agreements that supply electricity to 6 American states and over 20 million people. Wholesale energy prices spiked 18% on the announcement alone. 6 bipartisan governors issued an emergency statement begging for de-escalation. Warren Buffett called it the strategic equivalent of insulting your surgeon on the operating table, and warned of 30 to 40% price increases and potential rolling blackouts. Utilities are scrambling, insurance companies are reassessing, military planners are alarmed, and the families who depend on affordable Canadian electricity to heat their homes this winter are watching a president who seems more interested in getting a laugh than in keeping their lights on. The man Trump called governor controls more power flowing into American homes than Trump himself can deliver. The state Trump thinks Canada is provides the electricity that keeps actual American states functioning through the coldest months of the year. The subordinate Trump tried to create with a nickname is the one sitting on 37,000 megawatts of generating capacity and a network of transmission lines that 6 states cannot live without. Will Canada actually reduce energy exports? Or is the review itself enough leverage to force concessions? Can New England survive a winter without full Canadian hydropower imports? Or is the grid already too fragile, too dependent, too far gone to withstand even a partial disruption? And will Trump understand before it's too late that you don't call someone governor when they control your power grid, your heating systems, your hospitals, and the lights in 20 million American homes? He wanted to make Carney small. He wanted to make Canada seem like a state, a subordinate, a territory that should be grateful for American attention. Instead, he reminded the entire world exactly how much power Canada actually holds and how little it would take for that power to be redirected, renegotiated, or simply reviewed into a crisis that no tweet, no rally, and no nickname can solve. He called him governor. But the governor controls the lights,